On July 23, 1980, 31-year-old Helen Hagnes stood with her husband Janis outside their apartment building on New York's Upper West Side. Helen kissed Janis and told him she would see him later, and then she turned and began walking to work. It was early evening, and Helen could already tell it was going to be another hot New York summer night. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was humid. As Helen walked, she could already feel herself starting to sweat, and she just hoped she would still look okay when she got to work. She was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, but her platinum blonde hair and makeup were perfectly styled, like she was going to a formal event. And in her hand, Helen carried an oblong case that held her most prized possession in the whole world, her violin. Helen had grown up as a musical prodigy, becoming an award-winning pianist at the age of 4 and a skilled violin player at the age of 8. Now, Helen was a highly accomplished violinist, and she had performed with symphonies and opera and ballet companies all over Europe and North America. Helen made her way through the city and eventually turned onto a street about 10 blocks from her house. Up ahead, she saw the Metropolitan Opera House, or the Met as it's known, and her face lit up. Helen had dreamed about playing violin at the Met ever since she was a little girl, and she still couldn't believe that she was getting paid to come to this beautiful opera house to work alongside some of the most talented artists in the world. She turned onto a side street that led around the Met, and she entered through the backstage door. She smiled at a few Met employees and stagehands who were rushing back and forth getting ready for the night's ballet performance. Then Helen walked down a long, brightly lit hallway and went into the dressing room that was reserved for the women in the orchestra. Some of the other musicians had already arrived, and they all talked and laughed while they got dressed. Helen opened her locker and changed out of her street clothes into a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. She took a blue flower from her locker and fastened it to her hair with a bobby pin. Then, a little before 8 p.m., about an hour after she had arrived, Helen took her place in the orchestra pit with the rest of the musicians. The roar of the applause flooded the theater, the house lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and the orchestra conductor turned to the musicians and waved his hand. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. Even after all these years of playing, she still got nervous and excited. She raised her violin to her shoulder, placed her bow on the strings, waited for her cue, and started to play. About 40 minutes later, Helen heard the audience applauding once again. She had lost herself in the music like she always did, and so the first act of the ballet had sort of flown by in a blur. The curtain closed and the lights came up. It was the first of 2 intermissions. Helen placed her prized violin on her chair in the orchestra pit and headed backstage. She wasn't playing for the next section of the performance, and so she had an extended break. Helen walked right to the backstage elevator. She wanted to meet with the lead male dancer in the ballet, a famous Russian named Valery Panov. The elevator doors opened, and Helen stepped inside and stood between a man and a young ballerina. Helen told the ballerina she was going to see Panov, but she couldn't remember where his dressing room was. The ballerina said she didn't know either. Panov was a huge star, and he had his own dressing room that was separate from the rest of the dancers. Then the man chimed in and said Panov was on the 3rd floor. Helen thanked him, hit the button for the 3rd floor, and the elevator doors closed. The young ballerina stepped off the elevator at her dressing room floor. Then Helen rode up another floor, got off the elevator, and walked down a long hallway in search of Panov's dressing room. At 11:30 p.m., almost 3 hours after Helen got off that elevator, her husband Janis sat outside the Met in his van. Janis often picked his wife up to drive her home because walking at night in New York City in 1980 could be dangerous. Janis watched the dancers, musicians, and employees filing out of the Met, but he didn't see Helen. So he figured maybe she was still talking to one of her friends in the dressing room. But when it got to be midnight and Helen still had not come outside, Janis thought maybe she was getting a ride home with someone else and she had just forgotten to let him know. So he hopped out of his van, went to the nearest payphone, and called home. But there was no answer. So Janis figured there just must have been some miscommunication between him and his wife, and he headed home. A few minutes later, Janis walked into his and Helen's apartment, and it was empty. Janis thought it was a bit strange Helen wasn't home yet, even if she did get a ride home with someone else. But he figured maybe they had grabbed a drink before heading this way. Then he heard a knock at the door. This had to be Helen, and she must have forgotten her key or something. Janis went to the front door and opened it up, and suddenly he started to get worried. Because a nervous-looking man stood at the door with Helen's violin case in his hands. He said that he and some of the other musicians who played with Helen were really freaked out because Helen had left the orchestra pit during the first intermission and she never came back. He said a group of people had called the apartment and searched for Helen after the show, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Giannis took Helen's violin case and he closed his eyes like he was fighting back tears. He knew his wife would never just leave her violin behind somewhere, not even at the Met. In a flat, quiet voice, Giannis thanked the man for coming by. Then he closed the door, put down Helen's violin case, and went to the phone and called the police. In the early morning of July 24th, several hours after Giannis called the police, Detective Jerry Giorgio of the NYPD walked into the lobby of the Met. The two officers who had arrived first greeted him and showed him the photo they had of Helen Hagnes. Detective Giorgio looked at the photo and heard the lobby doors open behind him. He turned and saw a frantic-looking young woman running in. Giorgio held up his hand to try to get her to slow down and asked if she was okay. She introduced herself and said she was a ballerina in the performance. She had heard about Helen going missing from one of her friends, and she thought she might be able to help, because she was pretty sure she was one of the last people who had seen Helen. The ballerina said that she and Helen happened to be on the backstage elevator together during the first intermission, and Helen had mentioned she was on her way to visit with Panov. Detective Giorgio asked who Panov was. The ballerina smiled and said Valery Panov was one of the most famous male ballet dancers in the whole world. Giorgio thanked her and said her information was a huge help. He got the ballerina's information and told her he would contact her if he needed anything else. As the ballerina walked away, Giorgio handed the photo of Helen back to the two officers and told them to wait there in case anyone else showed up. Then he walked further into the grand lobby of the Met, and the design of the place was like nothing he had ever seen. The huge staircases leading to the higher floors almost looked like they led to nowhere and just disappeared into the darkness. Giorgio had just started to search the lobby when a security guard walked in and introduced himself. His boss had told him to come down and help the police if they needed it. Giorgio was relieved. He said he didn't want to waste any time. He needed a full tour of the opera house. But at this, the security guard busted out laughing. He said that would be impossible. The building was massive, with 6 stories above ground and 3 basements below. And there were so many hallways and hidden rooms that navigating the Met was like walking through a maze. Giorgio said they would get as many cops as they needed to comb through the whole place, but in the meantime, he at least wanted a tour of the backstage area where Helen would have gone during intermission. So the security guard led Giorgio into the theater, up onto the stage, and into the wings. Giorgio looked around the expansive backstage area, and he saw giant set pieces, black curtains hanging everywhere, multiple exits, and an elevator. Then he walked down a stairwell and found himself in a vast, dimly lit basement that made him feel like he was in a horror movie. Giorgio saw cases for double bass instruments that were bigger than him leaned up against the wall. And scattered throughout the basement, he saw old set pieces from past performances and large wooden crates filled with costumes and props. Giorgio started to feel overwhelmed. He thought if the worst had happened, if Helen was dead, her body could be in a crate or an instrument case or in one of the countless dark corners, hiding just out of view. At around 8 a.m., after hours of exploring the depths of the Met, Detective Giorgio went back to the lobby and checked in with the other 2 officers who were still there. He was about to find a phone to call the police station to get more help when a maintenance worker ran inside. And this guy looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Giorgio asked him what was wrong, and the worker said he'd just gone up to the roof of the building to turn on one of the ventilation fans. And while he was up there, he found a pair of women's black shoes, like the ones he'd seen the women in the orchestra wear. Detective Giorgio's heart sank. Helen had disappeared in the middle of a performance, and now her shoes might have been found on the roof. And Giorgio's first thought was that Helen went up there, jumped off the building, taking her own life. Giorgio and the other officers followed the maintenance worker to a service elevator, and they traveled up to the roof in complete silence. The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Giorgio had to squint as the daylight hit his eyes. The maintenance worker stepped out of the elevator and showed the police the pair of black shoes. Then Giorgio walked to the edge of the building and looked down, but there was nothing on the ground that looked out of the ordinary. So the officers spread out and searched the roof for any additional clues. and within a few minutes, Detective Giorgio heard one of them shout, "Oh my God!" Giorgio whipped around and saw an officer standing by this enormous metal fan, looking through the wide space between two of the blades down into the ventilation shaft. Giorgio joined him and leaned over to look into the shaft as well, and he thought he saw something about 30 feet below, but it was a little dark down there, and he couldn't tell what it was. It took a few seconds for Giorgio's eyes to adjust, but slowly, everything came into focus. There at the bottom, he saw the nude, bloody body of a woman. Shortly after, Detective Giorgio looked down the ventilation shaft and saw the woman's body. An NYPD homicide detective named Mike Struck finished his morning run in Central Park and called into the station to check in for the day. Dispatch told him not to even bother coming into the office. Instead, they said, go straight to the Metropolitan Opera House. Struck rushed home, got cleaned up and changed, and then raced down to the Met. The place was now buzzing with employees and police. And amid the crowd, Detective Struck was happy to see Detective Giorgio. The two men enjoyed working together, and they made a good team. Giorgio was calm and almost fatherly, while Struck was blunt and always seemed like he was moving 100 miles an hour. Giorgio filled Struck in on everything police had found that morning. They had found Helen Hagness's body in a large maintenance tunnel on the 3rd floor. It looked like she had fallen to her death through the ventilation shaft from the roof, but Giorgio was sure someone had pushed her, because her hands and feet had been bound with rope and there was a gag stuffed in her mouth. Giorgio thought the attack could have been sexual, but he had no idea if it was random or if somebody had targeted Helen. Then Struck went to go take Polaroids of Helen's body, and he worked with crime scene technicians as they searched for clues. In addition to a pink bra, they found a pair of black pants, a black shirt, and a blue flower, all near the body. Later that day, several hours after the discovery of Helen's body, the NYPD had set up a fully operational command post inside the offices of the Opera House, and teams of detectives, uniformed police, and forensics technicians scoured the building for more evidence. Not long after the command center got set up, Detective Struck left his and Giorgio's makeshift office, walked into the office of one of the Met's operations managers, and asked how many employees the Met had. But when the manager answered more than 800, all Struck could do was laugh. That was an impossible number of people to interview. Still, he asked the manager for a list of all of those employees, as well as a separate list of the people who were actually working or performing at the Opera House when Helen had disappeared from the orchestra pit. When Struck returned to his office, he found a crime scene technician waiting for him. The tech told Struck they were able to lift a pristine palm print off the outside of that ventilation shaft on the roof. In fact, the print was so good, the tech worried that some careless police officer or other investigator had touched the ventilation shaft that morning and made the print. Struck thanked the tech for the update and asked him to report back as soon as he knew anything, even if it was just to say that a cop had messed up and left that print. Then Struck sat down at what was now his desk, he grabbed his phone, and called Helen's husband, Giannis, and told him he needed to come in to the Met. Detectives Struck and Giorgio sat in their office, reviewing their notes while they waited for their first suspect. Forensics officers and the medical examiner had not found any indication of sexual assault, which made them think it was possible that Helen's murder was actually just staged to look like a sexual assault. And they thought maybe Giannis had met with Helen at some point during the intermission. Then they fought, and he took her up to the roof of the building, where he tied her up and killed her. As the two detectives theorized and talked through the case, the door opened and an officer led Giannis in. Giannis actually stumbled into the room and then collapsed into a chair across from the two detectives. Struck and Giorgio could tell Giannis was drunk just from the smell. And even if they couldn't tell from the smell, the open bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand made it pretty clear. This was a new one for both detectives. They had never seen someone show up to a police interview with a bottle of whiskey. But regardless, the detectives jumped right into the questions. They asked Giannis about his and his wife's relationship. Giannis was slurring his words, but he did manage to tell them that he loved his wife, and he had gone to the Met to pick her up and drive her home, but she had never showed up. Struck and Giorgio listened, but they knew that almost nothing Giannis said in his current state would ever hold up in court. I mean, the guy was drunk. So they told him they would have an officer drive him home, and after he'd gotten some rest, they would follow up with him if they needed to. Later that afternoon, Struck and Giorgio were sitting in the theater when the famous Russian dancer Panov and his interpreter walked in. Panov, according to that ballerina that Giorgio had met that morning, may have been the last person who'd seen Helen alive. Panov took a seat near the detectives and asked how he could help. Then, through his interpreter, he said he did know a musician had gone missing at the Met, but he didn't know anything more than that. Giorgio handed Panov a picture of Helen and said she was the missing musician, and the last time anyone had seen her, she was on her way to meet Panov. Panov looked down at the picture and then said something in Russian. The interpreter then told the detectives that Panov did not know this woman, and she never came to visit him that night, and he had no idea she was even planning to. Then Panov spoke for himself. He explained in broken English that at least 50 people came to visit him every night. It was nothing unusual for audience members or other artists to flood his dressing room, and he tried to meet as many people as he could and be as gracious as he could because he knew that a lot of people had helped him become a ballet star. Struck asked him where he was at the time Helen disappeared during the first intermission. Panov said he had rushed to his dressing room to get changed and then went into the audience. He wasn't in the second part of the ballet, but his wife was, and he loved watching her dance. The detectives knew it would be easy to confirm this if it was true. Audience members and the crew would definitely have noticed one of the most famous dancers in the world walking amongst the crowd. So the detectives told both men they could go. Panov said he was sorry about what had happened to the musician, and then he and his interpreter headed backstage. It was late in the day at this point, and everyone working at the Met was getting ready for that evening's performance. So Giorgio and Struck decided to head home and regroup in the morning. The next day, the detectives walked into the Met lobby and greeted the young ballerina who had flagged down Giorgio the day before to say she had ridden on the backstage elevator with Helen. As far as the detectives knew, she may have been the last person to see Helen alive, other than the killer. So they had asked her to come back to see if maybe she could give them a clearer picture of Helen's movements that night. The detectives led the ballerina to their office, and she sat down across from them. She said she was glad they called her because she had remembered something. When she was in the elevator with Helen, there was a man that was there with them. He had told Helen that Panov's dressing room was on the 3rd floor, and this man was still with Helen when the ballerina got off the elevator. Giorgio and Struck leaned forward. This was huge. It meant that that man on the elevator was either the last witness to see Helen alive, or he was the killer. Struck asked the ballerina if she could describe what this man in the elevator looked like. The ballerina squinted her eyes like she was trying to remember, but she shook her head and apologized. She knew he was a man, but that was about it. Detective Giorgio leaned over to Struck and whispered something in his ear, and Struck nodded in agreement. Then Giorgio turned to the ballerina and said he knew this was going to sound strange, but sometimes the police used a hypnotist to help witnesses remember things in more detail. So Giorgio wanted to know if the ballerina would agree to be hypnotized, and the ballerina said yes. So that afternoon, a hypnotist dimmed the lights in the office and then took a seat across from the ballerina. At the same time, Giorgio and Struck lingered in the corner, and an NYPD sketch artist sat a few feet away, holding his pencil and a sketchbook. The hypnotist told the ballerina to close her eyes and listen only to his voice. And slowly, the hypnotist used his soothing voice and his words to draw the ballerina deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation, until finally she was in a trance. Once she was, the hypnotist asked the ballerina to turn back the clock in her mind to the moment that Helen had stepped on the elevator with her. He asked the ballerina to look closely at the elevator and the man who was there, and to describe him as best as she could. The ballerina concentrated, and she began to speak, describing this man. She said he looked like he was between 20 and 25 years old. He was slightly overweight, had a large nose, brown hair, and bright red lips. And as the ballerina gave these details, the sketch artist began to draw. A few minutes later, the hypnotist gently brought the ballerina out of her trance and turned the lights back on. Police quickly made copies of the sketch and circulated it among the Met's employees. And while they were hopeful, there was the reality that a lot of people could fit the description of a young, slightly overweight guy with brown hair. But later that day, a Met employee walked into the detective's office and told them there was someone they needed to talk to right away. It was a stagehand named Vincent Donahue. Struck asked if Vincent fit the description of the man the sketch artist had drawn. The employee said he did, at least a few days ago, but on the night following Helen's murder, Vincent had showed up to work and he had completely shaved off his brown hair and he had a large scratch on his face. That afternoon, Vincent Donahue took a seat inside the detective's office and he looked annoyed. He said he needed this to be fast because he had a lot of work to do before the performance that night. Giorgio smiled and said he understood, but first he said he had to ask where did that nasty scratch on his face come from. Vincent said he and his girlfriend had gotten into a pretty bad fight a couple of nights ago and his girlfriend used her fingernails when she got angry. Detective Struck quickly jumped in and asked why Vincent had shaved his head. Vincent laughed and said during the argument with his girlfriend where she scratched him, she had said the only good thing about him was his hair. So after she had stormed out of the room, he had shaved his hair off just out of spite. Struck had a look on his face like this seemed totally ridiculous, and Vincent could tell. So Vincent quickly said, "Really, this is the truth." Then he told the detectives he didn't have anything to do with that musician getting killed. And he said instead of wasting time talking to him, they needed to talk to a guy named Craig Crimmins. Vincent said Craig was also a stagehand and he had missed a major cue to move scenery during the second act of the performance on the night Helen died. He had just left his backstage post and disappeared. Now, Struck thought Vincent could still be lying. However, the idea that a stagehand went missing around the same time that Helen went missing was suspicious. So Struck told Vincent he could leave and go back to work, but they might need him again. And as soon as Vincent left the office, Struck and Giorgio sent an officer to track down the stagehand, Craig Crimmins. When Craig stepped into Struck and Giorgio's office, he looked exhausted. Giorgio asked Craig to take a seat, and then once he handed him a photo of Helen and asked Craig if he knew her. Craig glanced at the picture and said he only recognized her from what he had seen in the news. He'd never met her or talked to her. She was a musician, and he didn't really interact with the musicians. Struck just stared at Craig while he spoke. He was young and had brown hair, just like the ballerina's description. So Struck asked if Craig had ridden the backstage elevator at all on the night Helen died. But Craig just shook his head. He said he'd been at his spot backstage the whole performance. Struck leaned across the desk and said if that was true, then why had his colleagues claimed that Craig had been absent from backstage during an important cue that night, specifically during the second act? Craig's face flushed and he stared down at the floor. He said he did miss a cue that night, but he didn't leave backstage. He was embarrassed to admit it to the cops, but he had shown up to work that night drunk and fallen asleep at his post. He told the detectives that another stagehand who worked right beside him backstage had seen him and could back him up that he was telling the truth. Struck and Giorgio questioned Craig a bit longer, and then they let him go. They quickly found the other stagehand Craig had mentioned, and this guy said Craig was telling the truth. He had passed out backstage and basically slept through part of the performance. With Craig's alibi checking out, the detectives still believed they had viable suspects among the other people they had talked to. But they still had hundreds more people to interview, and they still hadn't heard anything about the one major piece of forensic evidence that had been found, the fresh palm print that had been pulled from the ventilation shaft on the roof. So the detectives felt like if they didn't quickly find some new evidence, they were going to be stuck with an overwhelmingly massive suspect pool. 6 days after Helen's murder, on July 29, 1980, her memorial service was held at a New York City church. The church was filled with friends, family, and countless people from the Met. One of Helen's violinist friends performed at the service in her honor. In the 2 weeks following Helen's funeral, Detectives Struck and Giorgio continued their work at the Met, but the Opera House had grown oddly quiet. The ballet had finished its run of performances, and the next show had not opened yet. So the detectives found themselves wandering through the nearly empty, huge building, trying to find anything that they might have missed. But nothing came of those additional searches, and even after weeks of combing through the place, they still felt like there were corners of the Met that remained hidden. But just at the point when the detectives worried their case was about to go cold, Strzok got a call from an excited forensics technician. The tech said he could not believe it, but that nearly perfect palm print found on the ventilation shaft did not belong to a careless police officer or investigator like the forensics team had originally suspected. And it was a relatively fresh print, so it could belong to the killer. When Detective Strzok hung up, he told Giorgio what he just learned, and Giorgio got excited. This palm print was not a smoking gun just yet, but it definitely could be. It was very difficult to access the roof of the Met, so the detectives believed the print had to belong to somebody who worked or performed there, or someone who came by fairly often to visit a family member who worked there. Over the next several days, Opera House employees met with the police in groups of 2s and 3s, and they allowed officers to take their palm prints. And only one of them seemed really nervous about it when asked to give their print, and this was somebody Strzok and Giorgio had already spoken to. This person broke out into a sweat and said that they were uncomfortable with this whole situation. But Detective Giorgio smiled softly, and in his best fatherly voice, he said providing a print was the best way for police to cross them off the list and allow them to put all this behind them. So ultimately, this person agreed and gave their palm print. And when testing on that print came back, Detectives Giorgio and Strzok saw that it was a perfect match to the one found on the roof. And they believed they had found Helen's killer. Based on the palm print, evidence from the scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Hagnes on the night of July 23, 1980. The killer saw Helen walking down a hallway on the 3rd floor during the first intermission of the ballet, and they quickly walked down the hall and grabbed her arm. Helen turned around and didn't understand what was happening, but the killer just pulled out a hammer and pushed her into a stairwell. The killer dragged Helen down all the stairs to one of the sub-basements, and then once there, he demanded she take off her clothes. And Helen did. The killer attempted to rape Helen, but they couldn't. And so out of frustration, they demanded Helen put her clothes back on, and then they grabbed her by the arm, and still with the hammer in hand, they led her all the way upstairs to the roof. Once on the roof, the killer once again made Helen get undressed. Except this time, the killer also bound her wrists and her ankles, and they also gagged her. But Helen fought back. And at some point during the struggle, the killer knew they were running out of time. And so out of frustration and panic and anger and embarrassment, they scooped up Helen and they walked over to the air conditioning vent and they placed her on the ledge. And then, as Helen desperately tried to push past them and get back on the roof, the killer just raised up their leg, placed their foot on her side, and they pushed her into the vent. Helen would fall 6 stories to her death. And after she was dead, the killer reached down, scooped up her clothes, and threw them into the vent after her. After that, the killer ran to the door, believing they had disposed of all the evidence. Except they hadn't. They had accidentally left Helen's shoes up on the roof. The killer flew down the stairs all the way to the theater and ran backstage. However, by the time they got there, they were out of time. The intermission was over and the ballet had started again, meaning the killer had missed a very important cue. Craig Crimmins, the stagehand who claimed to have shown up drunk and fallen asleep backstage, killed Helen Hagnes. On the night of the murder, Craig was in fact the man on the elevator with Helen and the young ballerina. And when Helen asked about where Panov's dressing room was, Craig had chimed in and said it was on the 3rd floor. But that was a lie. He was simply trying to trap her. And so when Helen got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, Craig followed her down the hallway, grabbed her, and brought her to the basement, intending to rape her. However, he could not perform sexually, and so in his rage and humiliation, he dragged her up to the roof where he would kill her. Craig did resemble the sketch from the ballerina's hypnosis session. However, it was Craig's palm print on the air conditioning vent that made detectives turn their focus on him. And soon after the detectives discovered Craig's print matched the one on the ventilation shaft, they learned that the other stagehand who said he saw Craig sleeping backstage was lying for his coworker. But he thought Craig had asked him to lie for him just to cover up the fact that he had left backstage and missed an important cue. Craig Crimmins was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He went on to serve 40 years in prison and was paroled in August of 2021. 34-year-old Diane Newton King woke up before sunrise. She showered, she curled her bangs, she did her makeup, and then she dressed for work in the most professional women's fashion of the day. She put on pantyhose, a pencil skirt, and a blazer with the absolutely massive shoulder pads. It was the spring of 1990, and in Battle Creek, Michigan, Diane was one of the biggest names in town. Diane anchored the morning news show for Battle Creek's local TV station, WUHQ, which meant most days of the week, Diane had to leave her house by no later than 4:30 a.m. As she shuffled around her two-story farmhouse in her pantyhose, trying to figure out where her briefcase was, Diane's husband, Brad, hollered up at her from the kitchen to tell her that breakfast would be ready in 5 minutes. Diane was thrilled. She had recently discovered that she was pregnant with their second child, and so she was constantly feeling hungry. Diane finally found her briefcase, then she slipped on her shoes and made her way downstairs into the kitchen. Her firstborn child, 2-year-old Marler, was sitting in his high chair chomping away on some apple slices. Diane kissed him on the forehead before sliding into her own seat at the kitchen table. 43-year-old Brad brought Diane a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was her favorite, and he made it for her every morning. Brad worked part-time as a criminal justice professor at the University of Western Michigan, but he liked to tell people that his real job was taking care of Diane and Marler. And for the most part, that was actually pretty true. Most days, while Diane was at work, Brad managed things on the home front. It was an untraditional dynamic for the time, and some of their friends jokingly called him Mr. Diane King, but Brad didn't mind. He was proud of Diane, and he was happy to support her this way. Diane scarfed down her breakfast, gave Brad and Marler a kiss goodbye, and then she grabbed her coat and raced out the door just as the clock hit 4:30 a.m. Outside the farmhouse, Diane paused for just a moment. She'd always wanted to live on a farm, and when she looked out across their property, with the cement silo on the left and the old red and white Victorian barn on the right, and the hundreds of acres of farmland and woods surrounding the house, she felt like she was really living her dream, even though the family didn't do any actual farming. But someday, Diane thought, maybe after the baby came, she'd leave the TV station to focus on her family and maybe even grow a few vegetables. But for now, all that would have to wait. It would be months and months before the baby arrived, and Diane had a lot of things she wanted to accomplish before then. So Diane, standing on her front stoop, took one more deep breath of clean country air, then she walked down the gravel driveway and hopped into her brand new Jeep Wagoneer. Diane then slowly drove down her long driveway, and when she reached the black mailbox at the end of the driveway, she turned right onto Divison Drive, the street she'd called home for more than a year now. And from there, she snaked her way through the neighborhood out to the highway. About 20 minutes later, Diane was sitting behind her desk, diving into yet another busy day of reading the news. Most days, when Diane arrived at the office, the first thing she would do is review her scripts for the day. Then she would anchor the morning news show, and then Diane and her staff would spend the rest of the day reporting and writing stories for future news segments. Diane worked a lot, and she worked really hard. She was actually a perfectionist, and she expected perfection from the people around her. And sometimes that perfectionism rubbed her colleagues the wrong way. But the people who actually watched her on TV, the audience, loved her. Diane was constantly being invited to meet local celebrities and attend different charity events around town. But despite how well things seemed to be going both professionally and personally for Diane, something very unusual would start to happen to her, and it would change her life forever. It all started with a phone call. Diane was at the office, sitting behind her desk, working on a story, when her phone rang. Now, remember, this was 1990, so Diane did not have a cell phone or even caller ID. All she had was a landline. So Diane's phone began to ring, and without hesitation, Diane picked it up because the people who typically called her on this line were her colleagues or sources or people who knew her personally. But this day, the caller was not any of those things. Instead, the caller was a fan. Diane didn't ask the caller what their name was, but based on their voice, Diane guessed that the caller was a male, probably in his 20s or 30s. He said he had been watching Diane on TV, and he was so inspired by her reporting, he was thinking about getting into broadcasting himself, and he wanted to know if Diane had any advice about how to break into the business. Diane was caught off guard that this guy got her number, but she was polite and professional and ultimately recommended that he get enrolled in the communications department at the local community college. Diane even recommended specific classes she thought he should take. The fan thanked Diane for her time, and she wished him luck in his professional efforts, and then she hung up the phone, expecting never to hear from this guy again. But Diane would hear from him again. The fan started calling Diane's direct line on her desk on a very regular basis, sometimes as often as 3 times in a single week. And again, because Diane didn't have caller ID, she just kept answering his calls unintentionally. Despite being really annoyed by all these calls, Diane still remained very professional with the fan and continued to give him advice about how to do her job. However, the more he called, the more Diane sensed there was just something off about the guy. For one thing, she started to suspect that he wasn't actually interested in pursuing journalism. The questions he asked her didn't feel like the kind of questions you would expect from someone who was looking for guidance or information or even mentorship. They felt like an excuse to contact her, like he was making up questions just so that he could listen to her answer them. And there was something else that seemed kind of creepy. The more Diane heard from this guy, the more she noticed he had this very strange way of talking. It was slow and kind of slurred, almost like he was under the influence of some drug. Now, nothing this guy said to her was ever overtly rude or threatening, but after several calls, Diane couldn't help feeling like this guy could be a danger to her, and she had good reason to feel that way. For the last 2 years, every supermarket tabloid in the country had been running these stories about the rise in celebrity stalking cases. And now, the problem had gotten so serious that even the legitimate newspapers were covering these stories too. There were stories about celebrities getting threatening letters, and stories about their homes getting broken into, and some of these stories ended violently. Just 1 year earlier, an obsessed fan in Los Angeles, California, had shot and killed a young television actress on the doorstep of her own apartment. And it wasn't just the media that saw these stalking cases as being a big problem. Slowly, the government was also starting to realize that something had to be done. The problem was, nobody really knew what to do about it. In the 1990s, there were no anti-stalking laws anywhere in the country, and neither psychologists nor law enforcement could say for sure if it was better to confront a stalker head-on or simply ignore them. Diane wasn't sure if her situation with her fan would be considered a celebrity stalking case, but she was definitely feeling a bit scared of this guy and just wished he would leave her alone. So Diane consulted with the people closest to her, and everybody offered her different advice. One of her friends told her to be nice to the guy because who knows what would happen if she made him mad. One of her colleagues suggested that Diane just tell the guy to back off, but Diane could see that there was potential for problems in both of those situations. So Diane turned to Brad, her husband, not only because he was smart and an objective thinker, but also because, in addition to being a part-time professor of criminal justice, Brad also used to be a police officer. Brad, who was very concerned about his wife's stalking situation, told her that the safest thing she could do was simply cut off the guy's access to her. And the easiest way to do that was to set up some kind of arrangement with the receptionist at her work who could then screen Diane's calls. If the guy couldn't get through to Diane, eventually, Brad figured, he would just give up and stop calling. The plan made sense to Brad and to Diane, so she decided to give it a shot. Diane talked to the receptionist at the TV station, and they worked out a screening system. The way it worked was every call that came in on Diane's direct line would actually first ring at the front desk with the receptionist, and the receptionist would answer the phone, and if it was Brad or a colleague or a source calling for Diane, they would get pushed through. But when the receptionist got a call from the fan with the slow, slurred voice, she would tell him that Diane was not available. And the screening system worked great for several weeks. The fan would call and would be immediately turned away before Diane ever had to speak to him. But eventually, the screening system failed. One afternoon, around the end of the summer in 1990, Diane was in the newsroom sitting at her desk filing some papers when her direct landline on her desk started to ring. Diane picked it up before the end of the very first ring. She said, "Hello, this is Diane Newton King." And when she heard the voice on the other end of the line, she was so startled she almost dropped the receiver. It was the fan. He said, "Hello, Diane." Immediately, shivers ran up Diane's spine. Before Diane could hang up, the guy told Diane that he liked the way she looked and that he wanted to meet her in person. Specifically, he said, "I want to go to lunch with you." Diane wanted to scream, but she was so flustered and so scared that she sort of just started stammering until finally she was able to compose herself enough to tell the guy that she appreciated the offer, but she absolutely could not meet him in person. Then she slammed the phone down and started sobbing at her desk. As she cried, everybody in the newsroom looked over and was very concerned. That night, when Diane came home, she told Brad about what happened that day, and Brad was livid. How could this guy get through to her phone? Why didn't the receptionist screen the call? Brad called the station and demanded answers, but no one at the station, including the receptionist, had any idea how this guy got through to Diane. The station told Brad they would look into the situation right away and make sure that from now on, absolutely no calls whatsoever would reach Diane's line unless they had first been screened. Now, it's unclear exactly what the station actually did to ensure that, but from that day forward, the fans' calls were always intercepted by someone at the station, and so Diane was protected from speaking with him. And after a couple of weeks, the fans' calls to the station started to slow down. And after a couple of months, the calls stopped entirely. And soon, Diane just kind of forgot about the fan and moved on to more important things in her life, like the upcoming arrival of her second child, a baby girl. And with this child, Diane was becoming more and more conflicted about what she wanted in life. Suddenly, her career just felt a whole lot less important than being home with her kids. And so she started talking more openly with her family and friends about potentially leaving the station after her daughter was born so she could be a stay-at-home mom and enjoy a simple farmhouse life with her family. But all of that excitement and optimism about the future would come to an abrupt end one night in the fall of 1990. On the night before Halloween that year, so about 5 months after the first fan phone call, Brad told Diane that he was going to be working late that night at the university and so wouldn't be home until later in the evening, which meant Diane would have to be on primary parent duty for Marlar that afternoon when she got home from work. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be a big deal. Diane had done plenty of parenting on her own, and she loved spending time with Marlar. What made this night so different was that Diane was now 8 months pregnant. Her belly was massive, her hormones were raging, and her joints hurt so much she could barely walk. On top of all of that, Diane was in the middle of a big project at work that was totally stressing her out. Nevertheless, when she finished her shift at the station that day, Diane drove to Marlar's daycare, she picked him up, and then they headed home. By the time Diane turned onto her street, Divison Drive, Marlar was already passed out in the back of the car in his car seat, and Diane's body was really starting to ache. So when Diane turned into her driveway, instead of stopping the car and getting out to get the mail in the mailbox by the road, she simply pulled the car right up alongside the mailbox and reached out and collected the mail through her window. And after she had the stack of letters sitting on her lap, she began flipping through them. And right away, one letter caught her attention. It was in a typical white envelope, just like most of the other letters in her lap, but this one had no postage and nothing written on it, and it wasn't sealed. Diane opened the envelope, retrieved the letter inside, and then opened it up to read, and what she saw instantly terrified her. There was just one sentence on the page, but it wasn't written by hand. Each letter of this sentence had been cut out of a magazine and then scotch taped to the page, like one of those ransom letters you see in the movies. The sentence on this strange letter read, "You should have gone to lunch with me." Diane knew immediately that this letter was from the fan. Clearly, he'd found out where she lived, and he'd visited her house that day to drop it off. In fact, she realized with sudden alarm that this guy might actually still be in the area, waiting for her to come home. In that moment, Diane forgot about everything else she had going on. She forgot about how much her body hurt and how tired she felt. She even forgot about the sleeping baby sitting right behind her. Diane just started screaming like a banshee. Then she threw the car into reverse, backed away from the mailbox, slammed on the gas, and drove away from her house as fast as she possibly could. About 15 minutes later, Diane showed up at her friend Cindy Acosta's house. Diane and Cindy worked together at the TV station, and Cindy was one of the first people Diane had reached out to for advice when this fan started calling her. When Cindy opened the door, Diane, who was carrying Marlar, practically collapsed into Cindy's arms. In between sobs, Diane told Cindy about this letter and how scared she was, and right away, Cindy said, "We have to call the police." The police showed up a few minutes later and escorted Diane back to the farmhouse to search the property for intruders, but they didn't find anyone. Still, Diane was too afraid to stay at the house alone, so the police brought her back to Cindy's house, where she waited with Marlar until Brad was finally out of his class and could come and pick them up. After word got out about this threatening letter, the Battle Creek community really came together to support Diane. Also, the TV station beefed up their security around the office, Diane's sister bought them a dog, and Brad installed motion-censored lighting outside of their house. But none of those things actually made Diane feel any safer. She just couldn't shake the idea that her fan was watching her everywhere she went. Her fear got so paralyzing that Diane literally just stopped going outside the house at all except to go to work. And when she did have to go outside, she used a system that she and Brad created to ensure she was never outside alone. Diane would call Brad to tell him exactly when she would be home from work. That way, when she arrived, Brad would be outside waiting for her. If it was too cold for Brad to just stand outside, he would leave a particular light on in the house that was visible from the outside. This light was a signal to Diane that he was in the house and that everything was safe, so she could hustle out of her car and come inside no problem. On days that Brad was not home, when Diane returned home, she would call a neighbor to come meet her outside of her farmhouse. And if for some reason the neighbor arrived late, Diane would literally just sit in her driveway inside her car, waiting for the neighbor to show up. But all of this fear and all of this hiding had started to make Diane's world feel very small, and she really didn't like that. So after Diane gave birth to her second child, a blonde baby girl named Kateri, in November of 1990, Diane started trying to reconnect with her extended family. She started calling her sisters and mother much more often, and together, over the phone, the women would bond over the challenges and joys of raising their kids. And it was during this time, on these phone calls, that Diane started to talk more openly about her desire to leave the TV station altogether. She'd been thinking about it ever since she found out she was pregnant with Kateri, and now that Kateri was here, the whole thing felt much more real. Diane's extended family was very supportive and encouraging, and they pushed her to start leaving the house more often besides just going to work. They got her to start coming out to Detroit, where her extended family all lived, about 2 hours away from Battle Creek by car, so that she and her kids and the rest of the family could all participate more actively in each other's lives. And so, starting in late 1990/early 1991, every few weeks, after delivering the Thursday morning news break, Diane and her two kids would leave Battle Creek and head out to Detroit. They'd spend a few days with Diane's mother and sisters, and then on that following Saturday, they'd all head home. And on the night of Saturday, February 9th, 1991, about 9 months after the first call from that fan, this was exactly what Diane and the kids were doing, returning from her mother's. That night, Diane left Detroit a little after 4 p.m. So by the time she was pulling on to Divison Drive around 6 p.m., the sun was just beginning to set. Diane turned on her headlights, and when the King's black mailbox came into view, Diane tightened her grip around the steering wheel. It had been more than 3 months since she received the letter, but just the sight of that mailbox still filled her with dread. Diane turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the house, and as she made her way up the long, narrow path, she spotted the signal light on inside the farmhouse up ahead, meaning Brad was home and everything was safe and she could get out of her car and just go inside. But, as Diane was about to find out, Brad was not inside the house, and it was definitely not safe for Diane to get out of the car. About 30 minutes after Diane pulled into the driveway and saw the signal light, a call came into the dispatch office at the local police department. It was Brad, and he was hysterical. He was so shaken up by what he had just seen that he could barely form a sentence. But he was able to eventually communicate with the dispatcher that he'd just found his wife lying in their driveway, not moving, and there was blood in her mouth. When the police arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found Brad sobbing and pacing around the driveway. Diane was just lying in the middle of the driveway next to her car, and their two kids, 2-year-old Marler and 3-month-old Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of the car, crying uncontrollably. The reason Brad had left them in the car was because, as cruel as it seems, Brad knew from his work as a cop and as a criminal justice professor that even just opening the door to the car could potentially contaminate a crime scene. The responding officer walked right up to Diane and knelt down next to her. Even without much blood, it was obvious that Diane had suffered some sort of horrible injury and was definitely deceased. The officer spent a few minutes looking her over and eventually found the likely cause of death. There were 2 bullet holes in her body, one in her chest and the other near her waistline. An autopsy would later reveal that the shot to Diane's chest had been the fatal one. It had caused so much internal damage that she had died within 3 minutes of impact. Initially, though, the police had no idea how long ago those shots had been fired. But when the officer touched Diane's body, he found that it was still warm, which meant her killer might still be in the area. Instinctively, the officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Over the next 2 hours, a small army of investigators would descend on Divison Drive. They would search the property for fingerprints and evidence, and they would interview neighbors and potential witnesses, and after a little while, they would bring one of the best trackers in the state onto the property, a German shepherd named Travis. When Travis arrived on the scene, the dog quickly locked onto a scent trail. The dog took off running from the farmhouse straight back into the forest behind the home. The dog ran through muddy, brushy fields, then he crossed a creek, and then he sort of just stopped, turned around, and headed back to the farmhouse, where a crowd of investigators and neighbors were beginning to form outside. At the time, Travis's handler assumed that the dog had just kind of lost the scent at some point in the woods, and that was why he had stopped, turned around, and just gone back to the farmhouse. But many months after that night, once the police had figured out what happened to Diane, they would look back at Travis's initial movements that night and realize the dog had not simply given up and returned to the farmhouse. The dog had just continued to follow the scent trail, which happened to stop somewhere in the middle of the woods, turn around, and then come back to the farmhouse. In fact, that night that Diane was discovered, the killer was standing right outside of Diane and Brad's home among the police and onlookers. After being arrested, Diane's killer did not confess to the murder, and so we don't have every detail of what happened in the final moments of Diane's life. However, based on several key interviews and pieces of evidence, this is what investigators believe happened to Diane. About an hour before Diane returned home from Detroit on the night she was killed, Diane's killer entered her farmhouse and turned on a particular light inside. The killer knew about the light signal system that Brad and Diane had created to make Diane feel safe, and now the killer was going to use that system to lure Diane into a trap. After switching the signal light on, the killer walked back outside and headed for the old red and white Victorian barn, which was situated in front of Diane and Brad's property, just to the left of the gravel driveway. There was no light in the old barn, but it didn't matter. The killer had been on this property many times in the past and had even practiced this particular route in the darkness when no one else was home. Inside the barn, the killer walked past the family's tractor and the many tools they left lying on the ground. The killer walked past the family's protection dog, but the dog just kind of looked up and didn't even bark. And then the killer reached the back of the barn and climbed a narrow staircase which led to a large, dusty loft area. The killer paused briefly at the top of the stairs. The floor of the loft was covered in straw, and at the far end of the loft, away from the killer, was a sliding door that was open just wide enough for what the killer needed to do. The killer walked over to this slightly open door and peered outside. From there, they could see the front of the farmhouse and the driveway and the spot where Diane parked her car, which was about 70 feet away. The killer checked their watch. It was getting late, which meant Diane would be arriving soon. So the killer got into position. The killer lay belly down in the straw facing the gap in the door, and then they reached out their arm to the right and stuffed their hand into some nearby straw. A moment later, they pulled out a weapon that had been hidden inside the straw, a .22 caliber rifle. About 20 minutes later, the killer spotted a pair of headlights coming down Divison Drive. The killer raised their rifle and looked through the scope, and sure enough, Diane was sitting behind the wheel of this car. As she turned onto her long gravel driveway, the killer flicked the rifle off safe. The killer held Diane in their sights as she drove up the driveway to the house, and when she got close enough that the killer could hear the gravel under her tires, the killer slipped their finger over the trigger. Diane reached her normal parking spot located off to one side of the driveway close to the house, and then she turned the car off. As she gathered her things inside of the car, the killer pushed the rifle's barrel through the small opening in the sliding door and focused their sights on Diane's car door. A moment later, that door opened up and Diane stepped out onto the driveway. The killer paused for a second, taking in the sight of the woman they had terrorized for months and months, calling her over and over and over again at work, and then leaving her that threatening letter in her mailbox. Then, the obsessed fan / Diane's killer squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Diane squarely in the chest, throwing her body backwards onto the ground and tearing through her insides. After watching her fall to the ground, the killer quickly got up and, with the rifle in his hand, hustled back to the stairs, climbed down to the first floor of the barn, and then marched outside over to Diane's body. Everything was going exactly to plan until the killer spotted something he did not expect to see. Diane's two kids, Marler and Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of her car. The killer began to panic. Why were the kids here? The killer was certain Diane's plan had been to leave her kids in Detroit for the weekend with her grandmother. But, as the police would later discover, the arrangements for the kids were changed at the last minute because one of the kids had gotten sick while they were at Diane's mom's house, so Diane just brought the kids home with her. But for Diane's killer, the kids presented a huge problem. Because after killing Diane, the killer had planned to drive away, get rid of the gun, and then try to establish some kind of alibi before Diane was discovered. But now there were these two kids in this car without heat in the middle of winter in freezing cold Michigan, and so if the killer left, the kids would freeze to death, and the killer was not trying to kill anyone except for Diane. So the killer changed plans. First, he turned away from the kids, crouched down, and then fired an additional shot into Diane's body to make sure she was dead. This was the shot that tore into her waistline. Then the killer turned and ran into the forest behind the farmhouse and charged through muddy, brushy fields across a creek to a spot where they were able to hide the rifle, and then the killer turned back around and ran back to the driveway of the King's house. When the killer got there, they ran up to the car window and looked inside and waved to the two kids and said, "Everything's gonna be fine, okay? Daddy's here. I'm gonna make a phone call and then I'll be right back." Then, Brad King, aka Diane's obsessed fan, aka Diane's killer, ran inside of his house that he shared with Diane and called the police. When they answered, Brad hysterically told him that he had just been out for a walk in the woods, and when he came back, he had found his poor wife lying in the driveway, not moving. It would turn out Brad King had been obsessed with Diane ever since the first day he met her. She was beautiful and funny and more ambitious than anyone Brad had ever met. Diane dreamed of becoming a news anchor, and Brad wanted to help make Diane's dreams come true. So, while Diane was off working her way up to the news desk, Brad spent most of his time working to make sure she had everything she needed to be successful. He cooked Diane's meals and ironed her clothes, he handled the shopping, and when the kids came along, Brad took care of them too. And as far as Brad was concerned, everything was working out great. Until one day, when Diane came to him and told him that she wanted to quit her job at the TV station so that she could stay home and raise the kids. In fact, she told him she was planning to leave the station the summer after Kateri was born. Diane hadn't formalized this announcement yet, but pretty much everyone in Diane's inner circle knew about her plans. But the problem was, if Diane was going to stay home, then Brad would have to be the family's primary breadwinner, and being a part-time professor just wasn't going to cut it. He would have to go out and find a full-time job, which was something Brad simply didn't want to do. He had grown to love not working very much, and he was not prepared to change that. However, when Brad voiced his concern to Diane about not wanting to work full-time, She was empathetic, but said it was really important for her and the kids that she be home with them, so he would just have to kind of accept it and get a full-time job. However, Brad did not accept this. Instead, he decided he would just kill Diane. And because of his background as a police officer and as a criminal justice professor, he was confident he could get away with it. Brad knew that whenever a woman got murdered, the male partner is almost always identified as a primary suspect. So Brad knew he would need to create another suspect to divert attention away from himself. This is when Brad came up with this obsessed fan concept. About 10 months before Diane's murder, Brad began calling Diane's TV station, pretending to be this obsessed fan. He would intentionally slur words and slow down his speech to make sure Diane could not recognize him. Then, about 5 months after that first call, when by this point everybody in town knew about Diane's stalker, Brad decided to up the ante. On the night before Halloween, Brad left that threatening letter in the mailbox. He used cutout letters so Diane could not identify his handwriting, and he did it because he knew that type of letter would be more intimidating because of its use in scary movies. And the letter worked. It terrified Diane, and most importantly, it brought more attention to this fake fan, to the point where the police were actively searching for this person. This obsessed fan had become so real that by the time Brad was ready to kill his wife, he felt certain that nobody would even look twice at him. But thanks to his kids still being in the car after he killed Diane, Brad had not been able to flee the scene like he had hoped, and so he had to come up with a story about how he had been walking in the woods that night and had returned home and came upon his wife in the driveway, and that's when he called police. But this story didn't make sense. Police discovered that Brad would have known exactly what time Diane was coming home that night because Diane's mom had called Brad and told him when Diane had left her house. And based on the system that he and Diane had, Brad would have known that Diane would have expected him to be at their house waiting for her when she arrived. So why would Brad choose to be out on a walk in the woods at the exact moment Diane was arriving home? Also, neighbors had just seen Brad carrying the .22 caliber rifle that was used to kill Diane. The gun was located in the creek behind their house, roughly where Travis the tracking dog had gone on the first night of the investigation. And in the barn, police also found a single shell casing from the shot that killed Diane. On December 13th, 1992, Brad was convicted of murdering his wife, Diane. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed any remorse for her murder. Diane was buried in Detroit, near where her family lived. On her headstone, it says, "Beloved daughter, sister, mother." Diane was also, of course, a wife, but her family decided not to include that word.
Quiet nights make me loud in my mind. Listen close. Yeah. I was raised by the sound of a ceiling fan spinning. Mom whispering prayers while the world kept on winning. Hand-me-down dreams in a thrift store jacket. Hope in my chest, but my pockets never had it. They saw kids staring holes in the floor. Didn't know I was counting my exits indoors. Every you can't, stitch deep in my skin. Turned into fuel, I learned how to win. Cold nights taught me warmth isn't given. You earn every breath that feels like you're living. I moved in silence, let the doubt talk. Build my future brick by brick.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the Amazon Music follow button cleans their house, make sure you sneak in afterward and untuck all of their bed sheets. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballin Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events.